Hey, this is our demo for checkpoint 3 for 310. So initially, when we start our server, we already have a sections.json in our data folder. So our persist is going to load that in. So there's a valid sections for all the queries to run. So that's our given. So our first user story, we're going to demo what happens if the user enters a average that is too broad. So for example, if I enter 50, this is for users to find out all courses that have an average greater than that value. So they enter the value into the text box and then they say find sections. And as you see, it says result too large. And in our network request, we're getting a 400 bad request because that's what's getting sent by the API because it's more than 5,000 results. The other user story we have is if the user doesn't enter a numeric input. So if they enter some sort of text field because it doesn't specify it's supposed to be a number, and we send that request, it then tells you that the average must be a number. And again, it sends a status 400, and that's the message that comes in as the error because of an invalid average. And then our final case is when the user enters a valid average that doesn't give you more than 5,000 results. So let's say we put 95 and we find sections. So that's obviously a status 200. Everything was okay, and that renders it all the way down. And if we look at our result, just an example. So that's all our result. That's what we're getting from the backend. So that was our first user story. Our second user story is for finding courses that are taught by a certain professor. So in the first case, we're going to demo. So again, the given is that we already have a valid sections data set that's loaded. And if the user doesn't, and if it misspells the professor name or you puts a professor that doesn't exist, we get no professor with that name found. And that's because it's a valid query. So it's a status 200, but there's no professors. And so our result is just an empty array. And so because of that, we're rendering that message that since there's no professors with that name because the result is an empty array. And then in the other case, if they do enter a professor that exists, and we find sections then, we get all these sections. And if we look at our query, as you can see, we get all this data and it's status 200. And yeah, thank you for watching.